Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all very much for getting up so early for this important event. My name is Dean Godson, I'm Head of Security here at Policy Exchange, and it's a great privilege to be able to host this event today. We're hosting it because we believe, as in the words of Senator Arthur Vandenberg of Michigan, the chairman of the US Senate Foreign Relations Committee at the time of the Marshall Plan, he said, politics should stop at the water's edge. And the non-partisan dealing with the affairs of the security of the realm is an absolute key principle of our work. So we, of course, acceded immediately when the request came from Jim Murphy, Shadow Secretary of State for Defence, that the Labour Shadow team launch their consultation document here at Policy Exchange. Pleasure to welcome you here for the first time on this platform. Jim, also to welcome your team here today. We're all present: Kevin Jones, Russell Brown, Alison Seebeck, and Gemma Doyle. Thank you all for coming. We look forward, as they say in Chinese diplomatic communiques, after a difficult discussion, to a free and frank exchange of views. So Jim, thank you. Look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Dean. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's great to be here. For those of you who know me will know that I look a little more tired than usual. A night at the Brits. One of the few good things about opposition is I didn't have a ministerial red box to take home last night, so I went to the Brits instead. Other MPs there, including one SNP MP, just what he was doing at an event called the Brits. Don't know what we'll call it if Scotland ever became independent. Maybe just to annoy folk, keep it the same name. Look, I'm really delighted to be here this morning. Unusually, in a speech, I see my responsibility this morning is asking the questions, offering some comments, offering some analysis, and posing some questions rather than the traditional sense of here's a problem, here are some answers I prepared earlier. And I hope that characterises also the conversation we have at the end of the three speeches you'll hear this morning. Also to welcome the entire Shadow Defence team. And Dean, it's not your fault, but you omitted to mention one of our members of our team from the House of Lords, Lord Rosser, who's sitting here in expensive seats at the front. It's important to have a voice in the Lords, so we're delighted that he's here as well. But it's great that the entire Shadow Defence team here to emphasise again just how important an event we consider today to be. And the driving focus of the Shadow Defence team is to develop a defence policy fit for these modern times, responsive to dramatically changing world events, and a policy which enables us to maintain a position of global influence. This is important to the Labour Party for two reasons. Firstly, the first responsibility of any government is defence. And it's also the first responsibility of any political party that aspires to govern again. And our credibility as an alternative government relies on our credibility on defence. But much more substantially, the second reason why this is important is because this is a defining moment for our defence policy. The Arab Spring is the tip of the iceberg of the nature of the change we would expect to see over the next decade. New and emerging threats from cyber to bioterrorism, climate change and new economies demand new policy responses. Strategic reorientation by our principal ally, the United States, looking to the Asia Pacific, could impact on our joint priorities and the nature of European cooperation. Constrained fiscal circumstances due to the downturn limit expenditure and potentially our global reach. This all comes amidst immediate pressures and the priorities of Afghanistan, countering extremism, preventing proliferation, and confronting the fresh turmoil in the Middle East, which poses challenges to the security of the entire region. The wave of change moving across the globe today provides massive potential for irreversible disruption. In that context, Britain needs a defence policy which can keep up with events and anticipate those events. It must be agile with new and wide-ranging capabilities. It must prioritise coalition building, be attuned to the myriad of threats and trends, which coordinate defence with development and diplomacy much more effectively. And we hope that the launch of our defence review today will help us to develop a long-term vision for UK defence policy shaped around those priorities. Already, in the past few months, we have launched reviews into the future of the military covenant and into defence procurement reform. But it's the work that we're launching today that is the most significant. This will provide the strategic underpinning for our thinking on defence, which is all the more vital in light of the challenges we face and the shortcomings of the government's current strategy that they have in place. On the Strategic Defence and Security Review currently in place, we have been clear about our views on this. The government have not matched the ends with the means. There is a mismatch between those ends and means. It's precipitated a strategic shrinkage by stealth and have left us with dangerous capability gaps, most notably carrier strike capability for a decade. And I don't deny that tough decisions are necessary. We have been very clear in some of the cuts that we would make and those that the government have made that we cannot promise to reverse. But I do disagree with some of the decisions and the way in which they have been taken. And there is, after all, more than one way to spend an annual defence budget of more than £35 billion. A rushed review based on limited consultation has, in my view, been driven by savings and not strategy. Ministers focused on inputs before their outcomes. They did not ask some of the fundamental questions about how the world is changing, our ambitions in the context, the principles which should drive our defence posture, and how this would impact on required military capabilities. And it is a widely held view that the government's defence strategy did not survive its first contact with world events. For the Foreign Secretary to understandably say that the Arab Spring is as important as September the 11th and then fail to change course is simply not good enough. Libyan operations succeeded in spite of the defence review. We have capability shortfalls and a timid industrial strategy. And David Cameron's occasional ambivalence on defence policy lies in stark contrast to the commitment shown by previous leaders, including Tony Blair and Baroness Thatcher. Defence is a big budget item, but failure to prioritise defence is costly too. So our consultation, I hope, will stand in marked contrast to that approach that I've described. We need a defence strategy consistent, yes, with the financial circumstances that we face, but also with the strategic context in which we operate. Lasting more than a year, the consultation that we are launching today is open to all in the military and academic figures, all parties, and the general public. And we do want to foster a genuine debate, which is why today, as I say, I want to offer these comments in a spirit of posing questions and in offering context. The review will be conducted in three parts. Firstly, we will assess how the long-term changes to our security landscape will impact on our national interest and seek to identify what that national interest should be defined as. Secondly, we will ask what values we want to guide that pursuit of our national interest. And thirdly, we will assess how this will shape the structure of our armed forces in the future. By mapping our interests against international context, then challenging our own ambitions, making a judgment on what this means for our defence posture and force structures, we will do it while we've been both fiscally responsible and true to our progressive politics. So in the 40-page document that I think you all have in front of you today, which poses many of the big questions facing UK defence policy, there are a huge number of different areas identified, and I wish to mention just four. Firstly, on European defence cooperation. The US will remain our primary ally, but their shift towards Asia-Pacific and our collective withdrawal from Afghanistan and significant reductions in defence spending signals a reorientation which makes their priorities more numerous at a time of more limited resource. The impact on how the UK and US, but also the UK and our European allies work together must be considered much more strategically. It's untenable, is it not, that the US President announces that this is a moment of transition, and yet European nations act as if it is a period of status quo. European countries have to get more serious, and we must do more together to preserve our reach. And one of those areas on European cooperation, I think, is in expenditure. I believe the time has come for a conversation on how European NATO nations could coordinate spending reductions and changes to force structures. We need to explore how a coalition of cuts can help us end the practice of fighting conflicts together, but preparing for them individually. These decisions will always be for individual countries and individual governments and parliaments to make. But my worry is that a set of unrelated, isolated decisions by the European end of NATO will lead to the end of that process, people looking at what has been the aggregate consequence of a set of isolated cuts. I think while others call it smart defence, I like to look at it as I say, a coalition of cuts. So what is that conversation? How do we make it happen? Secondly, on defence and development. For those countries whose failure threatens international security, we must be in the business of building capacity in those nations in a way that enables effective national and local governance and the functioning of the rule of law and civil society. As a Shadow Defence Secretary, I've said this before, is that the most effective defence policy can be a world-class international development policy. Investment in education, democratic reform and viable economies can hinder the spread of conflict. That careful investment and that careful prevention of development policy can be so much more effective than the painful cure of military action. So we have seen in the Arab Spring how economic and political factors can lead to instability, and future preventative defence policy must be used economic, political and cultural influences to provide the conditions in which military action proves unnecessary. Thirdly, on new threats. I've talked about the need to prepare for new threats, and there's one that I wish to highlight briefly this morning. While the security environment of the 20th century was dominated by physics, the next may see biology centre stage. Bioterrorism simultaneously both exposes significant weaknesses in our security architecture and is a threat which could cause mass suffering. It is unclear at the present whether the UK and our allies are sufficiently prepared. Vaccines, detection, regulation of laboratories and proliferation are all huge issues. Biosecurity is one of the great global security challenges of the 21st century, and yet the SDSR announced no new funding or strategy to counter it. People always say that the equipment programme must be future-proof. The same is true of our security strategy, and that is why biosecurity and bioterrorism are central to the focus that we are launching today. Fourth and finally, the immediate threats that we face are as important as those on our horizon. We have 10,000 troops in Afghanistan this morning. A timetable for withdrawal has been set, and yet no clarity on the reasons determining the pace of withdrawal for the post-2014 settlement. We have moved from a conditions-led to a calendar-driven approach, and without a game plan for a long-term representative political settlement, the nation's fragile fortunes could be reversed. And just because our government doesn't talk about this, the biggest priority for our nation's defence currently, the challenge does not become any less pressing. The government has to work harder at maintaining the consensus with the public in Afghanistan. And that means demonstrating clear political strategy to match the military might of the past decade. I'll finish with my concerns on this matter. Is that I've spoken once before in passing on this, is that the concern I have about Afghanistan, and the reason why I mention it in the way that I do today, is that 1.5 unpopular wars is on the cusp of creating a permanently unpopular concept. Iraq, we all know, is unpopular, for reasons there's no point in rehearsing this morning. But Afghanistan, in some ways, can be misunderstood by a busy public, and Afghanistan is on, I think, while never as difficult as Iraq in terms of public opinion, is nevertheless part of creating an unpopular concept, and that 1.5 unpopular wars. And I believe in a country, the United Kingdom, and I believe in a party, the Labour Party, and I believe in a defence approach, which says we do have responsibilities beyond our own borders, as we see in the Arab Spring and beyond today. And unless our government here in the United Kingdom has a mature conversation with a clever British public about what shape we'll leave Afghanistan in, the need for a deal with political elements that we have been in conflict with for the past decade or more, the fact that British troops will remain in Afghanistan in some form beyond 2014, unless we have a British government willing to have that conversation with the British public, I think the chances of that permanently unpopular concept being embedded in public's contemporary consciousness is very real. It cannot be left to the opposition to make the case for the military intervention in Afghanistan. We cannot be doing that alone. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for being here this morning. As I say, I sought to set out some of the principles and pose some of the questions, and over the next months and year, I look forward to as many of you as possible being involved in what we hope to be a thorough and thoughtful strategic conversation. Thank you very much.
First time I think here on our platform, so thank you for coming. We look forward to hearing
Well, thank you very much, Dean. This is a slightly unusual format for myself, and it's a bit like being a discussant after the main speaker. I suspect all the cameras they're still actually turned on, so that's good news. They came to see me, really, Jim. What I thought it would be helpful to do is make some observations about the sort of questions which the review you're embarking on should be addressing. And Jim Murphy's outlined quite a number of those, but I wanted to add some more. And I think the first thing to say is a comment about what one should not expect such a review to achieve. It doesn't seem to me that it would be appropriate for a defence review in opposition to come up with detailed plans for exactly what a Labour government coming to power in 2015 would spend money on, because many of those decisions are ones that can't be made without access to the sort of detailed information one only can get in government. What it is legitimate for an opposition party to do, what it's very important for an opposition party to do, is to give the public an idea of the principles on which its defence choices would be based, and where it stands on some of the key trade-offs in defence and security policy that we will have to face in a period of limited resources. And I think this document starts along that road, but clearly the process designed to take it further. And the starting point, of course, as Jim Murphy has already said, is that we are at a key turning point in British security and defence policy. With war with Iran a real possibility over the next year or two, with the US tiring of a decade of war in Iraq and Afghanistan, 1.5 wars, perhaps they could be called, and not least with the full implications of the rise of China in all its many manifestations, security being only one, really only just beginning to impact on security thinking in Europe, but likely to be a growing factor in the years to come, influencing everything from conflict prevention policy in southern Sudan to climate change, energy supply routes, and so on and so forth. And this could well be a revolutionary decade in all those different dimensions. I really wanted to just seek to ask some questions in relation to 6 particular points. The first is in relation to Europe. The review document, indeed Jim Murphy himself, I think very usefully put some considerable emphasis on the importance of greater European cooperation on defence, whether one calls it smart defence or a coalition of cups, as he suggested, we can debate. And that's, I think, an important signal to send out, that the United States is a very important ally for us, but our neighbours are also very important allies. France, most of all, but also other European countries. But I think it would be useful to complement that discussion of European states as producers of security in the military sphere with an analysis of the risks that face Europe as a result of the deep economic and indeed political crisis that Europe is now in, and the Eurozone in particular is now in. The all-consuming priority of many European leaders in these days, and I suspect in the months and years to come, will be how to get out of the deep economic and therefore political crisis we are in as a result of what's happened in the Eurozone, and of course that's in itself in large measure a reflection of the financial crisis we entered into in 2008, 2009. And that involves both a short run and a long run risk assessment. If the Eurozone does begin to disintegrate and we return to a Europe of national currencies, then the single market may not survive. There's a lot of support, not least in our country, at a popular level at least, to move away from freedom of movement of labour, freedom of movement of capital, all the things we've been used to since the 1950s. And that doesn't mean a return to the sort of nationalism I think we saw in the 1930s, but it will be harder to envisage strong European defence cooperation in that sort of Europe. And the progress, on the other hand, if there is successful resolution of the Eurozone crisis, the Eurozone more or less holds together with all but perhaps one or two countries, then that will create other problems for countries like the UK, which appear to be settled in the outer layer of Europe and certainly aren't going to be joining Schengen or the Euro anytime soon, because if progress towards fiscal federalism really is made amongst core countries, France and Germany and others, then the creation of a core Europe in which more and more decisions in relation to economic matters are made without the UK participating, then I think that could well have a spillover into security and defence debates. And in both scenarios, Euro collapse or Euro deepening, slow growth, high unemployment could well lead to the rise of political extremism of the sort we've already seen hints of in Hungary, and the return of new interstate conflicts, even perhaps bringing in Russia at a stage. So European states continue to be key providers of global security, but we shouldn't, at our peril, ignore the risk that Europe can also be a source of insecurity in the years ahead. The second point I wanted to make, and again this is something the document touches on in passing, is the impact of the clear shift of the United States away from large-scale stabilization missions. There is clearly a geographical shift underway in US security policy from Europe and areas which they deem to be relatively secure from their point of view towards Asia, and to some extent a shift away from the Middle East, though I don't think that should be overstated. But that's paralleled, I think, with an equally important functional shift in terms of the sort of wars the United States is prepared to fight. And one of the lessons that the United States has drawn from the 1.5 wars is exactly the lesson they drew from Vietnam in the early 1970s, that the United States will continue to be an active global player, but it will seek to avoid in a way which they did not avoid, and we did not avoid in the last decade, the sort of drawn out stabilization missions we've seen in Iraq and Afghanistan. Whether or not their outcomes the desired outcomes have been achieved, and we don't know that yet in either country, I think. Even if they're successful in large measure in creating stable and democratic states in those two countries, the cost of doing so has been so great in blood and treasure that there would be enormous reluctance to get involved in that sort of operations again. And we've had a lively national debate in the UK about what went wrong in our deployments in the south of Iraq and in Helmand province during those two conflicts. And I think one of the tests of a Labour review, indeed one of the tests of government reflection on that experience, is whether we've drawn lessons about how we can do, as the UK, stabilisation operations better. But I think such a review also needs to take a view on the broader strategic choices that the United States appears to be making in relation to stabilisation operations. How will that shift impact on the UK and its priorities? Since certainly in the recent past we haven't been involved in such large-scale operations without the United States in a leadership role. And I think we also need to look back at that experience in Iraq and Afghanistan and ask whether we always used our influence wisely. Did we have any influence on the key decisions made by the United States in those two countries. Third, I was struck by the sentence on page 23. I had the benefit, by the way, of getting this document yesterday, so I have the edge on you on that, in that regard. I was struck by the sentence that emphasised that the role of values in Britain's defence will increase, and indeed should increase. After a period in which we were told repeatedly in Afghanistan that we mustn't talk about values in relation to Afghanistan. It was all about interests. It was all about blocking the chain of terror from Afghanistan all the way back to terrorism in the streets of London. I thought it was quite interesting, perhaps more honest, to emphasise the continuing role of values in defence policy, responsibility to protect, if you like. Clearly, values and interests are intertwined. But if you look at many of the interventions of the last decade or more, then values have played an autonomous and important element in those decisions in the Balkans and Sierra Leone, indeed I think also in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I think that's an interesting thing which should be interesting to explore further. It's interesting, I think, to ask whether that signals some difference in approach between the UK and the US, which, although in the US also values, I think, play a useful role. And not least, it raises the question, of course, are we prepared to put our resources and sometimes the lives of our service people in defence of those values? Fourth, the document gives a long list of the programmes that the government is underfunding, or indeed the programmes the government cancelled as part of the SDSR, and argues that there's more than one way to spend a budget of almost 45 billion, implying that Labour would have made different and better choices in the SDSR without saying exactly what those choices would be. I would caution, as I've already done, about getting too detailed at a programmatic level in opposition, but I think it would be useful in saying how Labour's choices would be different, to make some broader judgments, for example, between capabilities for enduring stabilisation or for war fighting, one of the trade-offs which did confront the National Security Council in the government review, between strategic autonomy, including industrial autonomy on the one hand, and forces which perhaps are larger but more dependent on the United States. One lesson some draw from Libya is that we should, in future, as Europeans, be prepared to conduct that sort of scale of operation without the Americans, given how much we spend on defence as Europeans in total. That's not an unreasonable aspiration, it seems to me. But if our top priority in constrained defence budgets was to fill the gaps generated by Libya, suppression of enemy air defence, for example, then other things would suffer. You could end up with more self-reliant forces, but ones which were smaller and perhaps less capable of the United States. There's a question there, and that's a military capability issue, but it's also an industrial issue. Like the government, the document explicitly, quote, rejects any notion of the shrinking of our influence, end of quote. I find it hard to understand what this term means in practice. Of course, any state, certainly our state, wants to maximize our influence. But whether our influence is declining or not is not solely in our own hands. And certainly in a world in which the United Kingdom, along with the rest of Europe, is declining as a proportion of global income, I think we need to be careful about mapping where the trends in global influence are and global power are before making statements which appear too canutish, to put it crudely. It's important, I think, to have a convincing narrative, a theory of influence, if you like, which explains how we use military power and other capabilities to maximize the UK's influence about things that we care about. And whether we're able to achieve a shrinkage of our influence, I suspect, depends to a very large measure whether the power of others grows. And the final 6th point, perhaps I could add if I may, is I think it's interesting that this document is a defence review. The government had a national security strategy and the strategic defence and security review. And this document actually refers to the next SDSR in 2015, which I took to be at least an implicit pledge from the Labour Party that they would conduct an SDSR in 2015. So it raises the perhaps rather boring and bureaucratic, but I think quite important point for a party in opposition. Does it make sense for Labour to continue to conduct a defence review, or at what stage does that broaden to something which also encompasses other aspects of security? So those are none of those points to detract from what I thought was a very interesting and at times quite revealing document. But clearly it's the start of a process, and I will look with interest to how it develops over the next couple of years.
Thank you, Malcolm. Now, my great pleasure to ask Major General Tim Cross to round off the formal set proceedings. Many of you know he was commissioned to the Royal Army Ordnance Corps, service in Northern Ireland, Germany, Cyprus during the Cold War years, and then latterly attained eminence in the conflicts in Bosnia, Kosovo, and finally Iraq. Delighted to be able to welcome you on our platform.
Thank you, Dean, very much. One of the things we learned on the High Commander Staff course is that other people eat your sandwiches, and coming on third in this sort of appearance is inevitably, I'm going to have some of the same points. But actually, in some respects, I think that's a good thing, because I think the team then hear the importance of some of these points that we outside the team believe. Let me start. I'm a military man. Let me start with my favourite quote, and I know there are one or two ex-military in the room. H.G. Wells is reputed to have said that the professional military mind is by necessity an inferior and unimaginative mind. No man, he said, of high intellectual ability will willingly imprison his gifts in such a calling. Well, that's me, and I follow on with it. I don't know what I have to say about politicians, but anyway, I'm now not trying to be academic. But I do come to this with a bit of baggage. I spent 5 years, just finished 5 years, as the Army Advisor to the House of Commons Defence Committee, and Kevin and I cross-swords occasionally, I think early on, particularly. My eldest son is a nuclear submariner. My youngest son is in the territorials. My son-in-law is currently serving in Kenya as a regular Army officer. So I do carry baggage on this, but I don't apologise for that. I think this is, again, I had this yesterday. I was going to come along to be sitting where you are, and I was rung up and said, would I be prepared to say a few things? I got a copy of this yesterday and got around to reading it last night. And I do think, without being condescending, it's a really important piece of work, and I enjoyed reading it, and I liked a lot of what I saw. I think this development of strategy and where we're going in the defence world between 2015 and 2020 is really important. First point I want to make is this. We're operating, we understand as we read these documents, there's a danger of us believing we're operating from a secure home base. Now, some aspects of that are obvious. The economic crisis is an obvious one. But I've sort of been part of an organisation that's been managing decline for about 40 years, really, the size and shape of the British military. And I think we're getting to a point where we have to ask ourselves some hard questions. You reach a point where there is a critical mass of capability, below which, if you fall, you are no longer in the league of this stuff. I actually would argue the Royal Navy is pretty close, indeed I would argue it's below critical mass now. It's not just about numbers of people or equipment. It's about an intellectual capital. It's about an ability to reach into the defence industry. It's about all sorts of scientific and technological stuff alongside that. So I would argue that this is a very crucial review. And as we begin to emerge from this economic crisis, we have to ask ourselves a question, do we want to regain this position of being a premier player in the defence business? Secondly, alongside that, I think we have to recognise that there are things going on in this country that maybe will undermine some of the things that we would like to think are going to be relatively easy. The social political foundations of our own nation state, is that going to remain stable and secure? What's going to be happening inside this country in 5 to 10 years ahead? I think there's a real change coming actually in terms of this whole me first capitalism and a lot of the debate that's currently going on in that sphere. Finally, nobody's mentioned Scotland, but both of my previous speakers, I think, are from Scotland. I think I first raised this as part of the Defence Committee about 18 months ago with the MOD, and to be absolutely brutally honest, I was told, you don't understand, this is not an issue, don't worry about it. Well, I think we need to think seriously about what might happen if Scotland declares its independence. So then my next point is what is involved in assessing this, and I would encourage the team to gather what I call a tomorrow team of thinkers in this business. I would encourage them to spread their wings beyond the groupthink that normally goes on, the turf, the ego, and so on. Involve defence industry, involve people outside the normal run-of-the-mill defence work. I would naively suggest that actually some behind-the-scenes conversations with the current government and other parties, because defence is too important to be swinging around between general elections and so on. So I would encourage an integrated approach. For some time, I use the example of what happened in defence post-World War II. We need to remember we had an Admiralty, we had an Air Force Ministry, we had a War Office, independently funded under government. We then created a Ministry of Defence. Finally, we got around to creating a permanent joint headquarters. I would argue that we seriously need to think about the whole of this security environment, and I would endorse Martin's point, this should not be about defence policy, this should be about security policy. And it should be about how does the Foreign Office, how does DFID, how does MOD work together to deliver our intent in the years to come. And other players too, non-governmental agencies. So a new strategic department, question mark. Some sort of development beyond the national security strategy and the National Security Council and so on. My next point is to focus on communities. Don't focus on the traditional hoods in this business. It's about the future of what communities will look like in the 5 to 10 years ahead, and indeed beyond that. Community security, weapons of mass disorder, cyber and so on, which are going to start playing a part in this. I think the EU is a really interesting discussion, and we haven't got time to go into huge chunks of it. I just happened to see something yesterday advising, or somebody sent me an email, said, read an excellent book with the world's worst title, Behavioural Conflict, Why Understanding People and Their Motivations Will Prove Decisive in Future Conflict, by Andrew Graham and Steve Tatum. Essentially, it says the European crisis is turning many European armed forces into little more than armed pensions. Something radical needs to be done to bridge the abyss between strategy and austerity into which our collective armed forces are falling. And I think a hard-nosed look at this whole issue of Europe and its defence policy and how it works together, the reality of what's been going on over the last few years with the other major players in Europe, and their genuine, maybe deep-seated reluctance to engage in conflict. What does that mean? What does it mean in relation to Africa, which nobody's mentioned? I think Africa is going to be really important in the next 5 to 10 years. And the EU's strengths of soft power, smart power, its links into Africa and so forth, how do we use that if they're not prepared to use hard power? And where does our piece fit into that? I think it's again, there we haven't got to go into, but I think it's really important. Picking up Martin's point, I think one of the most important things that's happened in the UN in the last few years is the responsibility to protect. It is a responsibility, not a duty, but what does it mean in terms of our values as well as our interests? I think there's a really important issue here to be looked at as part of this review. What does that mean in terms of the just war principles? How does it affect our decision to engage? What are the principles that we're going to be laying down that says when we will use force, how we will use force, and why we will use force? I think we need to look seriously as part of this work at what I call the infrastructures for peace. We have got a lot of people pouring huge amounts of money into conflict. We have very few people pouring very little resources into peace building, conflict prevention, defence diplomacy, soft power. We talk about these things, but if we compare the resources, intellectual as well as every other resource, time, treasure and talent, we do not understand this world better as well as we should. There are countries around the world beginning to do this. People in Africa, Kenya are really looking at this, other countries in Africa. And I think understanding what do the infrastructures for peace look like, what do you need to put in place before you go into these places? I'm one of those who've been into a number of conflicts over the years. They're always going to be over in 6 months. They're always going on 10 years later. And we need to learn. So this is about what effect we want to be able to bring to bear. It's about these capabilities, pan-government, that are needed. It's not about platforms at this stage, and I would endorse that. Although I do understand that inevitably there will be those who say, well, how many aircraft carriers are you going to have? My argument would be, don't even think about that till we know why we want aircraft carriers. How do they fit into other things, other instruments of power? So I think this is a really important piece of work. I could commend you for it, Jim. Thank you very much indeed for allowing me to be with you today. I'm happy to help with any questions.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you to all our panelists for 3 outstanding presentations. They've very kindly agreed to take questions. One of the panelists said beforehand not necessarily to answer them, but they will take questions. So, if I could see the first question, only one house rule, no question too outrageous, you just have to state your name and organisation. Gentleman there.
Oh dear. Okay, I'm Kevin Tevitt, former Permanent Secretary of Ministry of Defence, now in industry, so forgive my interest the way I put the question. Entirely agree that one needs to think in broad policy terms, but I think also it would be important for the review not to simply go into blue skies and still keep feet on ground, otherwise it won't be credible. And we face a very serious issue at the moment in the sense that the trajectory of our defence capability is going to hit a trough at about 2015. And currently the government policy has a 2024 structure vision. You don't want to talk about core structures, but actually it's inescapable. And to get through that valley of death, as it were, onto 2020, for the UK to retain the capabilities it would like to have, or believes it wishes at present, will be a non-trivial challenge. I think my question is, and I noticed, I think Tim Cross mentioned engage industry in the discussions. The elements of generating military capability, and to some extent the soft power as well, involve technology and industry as much as they do armed forces. And one of the problems has been a failure to engage in that dialogue at an early enough stage to plan capability from R&D and technology. And we know about the growth agenda as well as the defence agenda, and to our route. Just a plea, really. There's been a reaction currently against engaging too closely with the defence industry as a result of the perception that the earlier was too cosy, that, to put it crudely, government was being ripped off by the big defence companies who had a soft life. So the policy at the moment is arm's length, off the shelf, a rather harder view about what constitutes military capability. I would simply enter a plea that the more one does engage at an earlier stage, the key elements of that delivery of capability, which includes industry at an early stage before you ever think about platforms. That may be one of the best ways of getting to the 2020s in the way that we hope to do there, and keeping our options open technologically to cope with a very different range of threats that will probably be present by that stage.
Okay, you want to? Would you wish to do one at a time, or would you?
One at a time for the moment. Then
it's always easier when it's 3, so you can miss one of them out. But Kim, you've lived in this world in 2 careers now. I'm not going to rerun the process we had on a consultation on procurement reform, but I think one of the things we've got to look at, and I know you've strong views on this, is the MOD as an intelligent customer, and the capacity of the MOD to interact with some of these world-leading companies. And I think one of the important reforms that we could have, I think, is having a military career in procurement with progression, promotion, rather than, you'll know this, but not everyone will know, kind of sense of you almost do a 2 or 3 year sabbatical in uniform in procurement. So having a designated career path with promotion for those from our armed forces in a procurement as a profession, I think it would make the MOD a more intelligent customer. But then you get to the issue about sovereign capability. What is it we should build? What should we always have the capacity to construct, design, build, service, upgrade, modify? Which pieces of military equipment or capability must always have designed, made, upgraded in the UK, stamped upon them? Now that's part of an open conversation that we're going through at the moment, but we cannot buy off the shelf from overseas for all sorts of different reasons and all different parts of our military capability. The one that's a no-brainer is in nuclear and deterrent aspects of that in terms of having a sovereign capability, but there are others as well. But so we know the problem. We know without rerunning anything else. Liam Fox, and I'm not going to rerun anything. Liam spoke regularly we're buying off the shelf. Philip Hammond at the moment less so. They produced the industrial strategy white paper recently, which I think took it was much delayed, and I was hoping it was something worth waiting for. It hasn't yet proven it's worth as something having been worth waiting for.
Can I comment on that, if I may? I do think this is a hugely important question, and I do think that as part of this decision we need to make as a nation, as do we want to stay in the Premier League and have this critical mass, of which defence industry is a key part. And the positives that come out of that in terms of high technology, engineering capabilities and so on. So I just want to reiterate that I think that's a really crucial part of how you see this coming through. Having said that, I want to counter something you just said, which is, I carry baggage on this, but the old traditional way of saying people like me did tours at regimental duty, did tours at the staff, did tours on weapons staff. So I did a 2-year tour in Paris, France, on guided weapons. I did a tour as a staff officer. I did lots of tours of regimental duty, both on operations and elsewhere. And that balance of developing a military career, I think, is hugely important. I am dead against putting military people in and keeping them in a procurement field for the next 30 years. I've worked with other nations who've done that, and they are people who lose their cutting edge of operational understanding over time. Some better than others, but as a principle, I'm not in favour of putting military people permanently in the procurement business. Lady Delman.
Caroline Darwin, the Henry Jackson Society. I came back from East Africa yesterday, where I spent time on the ground with DFID in the arid areas bordering Ethiopia, South Sudan and Somalia. And I was looking at your comments about the risks of militarisation of aid. In fact, on the ground, there's no strategic link whatsoever with our security posture and our compassionate posture. And I was wondering what steps you're taking, even at the set-up stages of this review, to ensure contact between your groupings in the shadow of DFID and MOD and the FCO.
Very quick answer is that the document you see today has been through kind of tortuous process sometimes in politics, but actually it's a good, that's a traditional sense, and certainly in government, the kind of tortuous processes. But on this document today, we've really great cooperation with the Shadow Foreign Office team and our Shadow DFID team. And you see, as you get time to read through it, you'll see there are actually parts of the work that we're talking about will be led by our Foreign Office team. So it's myself here today with others, it really is a joint effort between all three. And actually on things like procurement, it's also the BIS team. So it's a whole Labour Shadow Defence, whole Labour Shadow team effort.
Anyone else want to?
I would endorse the intent behind the question. Absolutely key, and it's why I would argue, I'm not saying this is the right answer, but I think genuinely the team should say, do we want an MOD in 10 years' time? Or do we want something different? What would it look like? And this Africa piece and aid and so forth linked into it, I think it's hugely important.
Could I just add one thing? I think certainly in the last period, there's been a tendency to see Sub-Saharan Africa as DFID's region, not MOD's region, and that's understandable in part because of the focus in Iraq and Afghanistan. But as we transition out of Afghanistan and resources are released as a consequence, and as Tim quite rightly pointed out, the enormous security challenges that are arising in various parts of Africa, there is an opportunity to have a more joined-up approach because we will have the capabilities to help the security situation in places like Somalia and South Sudan and so on. So I welcome what Jim said in terms of coordination across the different shadow teams on this issue, because it's only by doing that you get a joined up approach rather than, and it's easier in some ways to do it in opposition because in government you have these enormous bureaucracies who have goodwill to cooperate, but the way they're structured often militates against it.
Name and organisation.
Thank you. Carol Walker from the BBC. Despite all those warnings about looking at strategy rather than specifics, I would like to ask a bit about that, because you talked about the dangerous gaps in capability. You had clearly flagged up, for example, the aircraft carriers. Isn't it a fact that because of, by the time of the next general election, were a Labour government to come into power, you would be inheriting still a huge deficit? Aren't you going to be on many of those really big decisions, like the aircraft carriers, locked into the decisions made by the existing government. There's no way you can simply plug that gap in the short term. And if I could just ask a quick one on Afghanistan as well, because you seem to be saying that overall you support the government's approach, but you're worried about being calendar driven. Are you saying that if things are looking tricky in 2014, just push the deadline back, in which case isn't it meaningless? Thank you.
Well, on the cuts thing, the government there's three sets of cuts. There's those cuts the government are making that we support. We've been pretty clear about that. So if it saves money bringing the folks home from Germany and the tank regiments that we're, regardless of which horizon we scan, it's difficult to envisage using those tank regiments. So those sorts of cuts that they save money, we're in favour of. There are those that we worry about, but that we can't reverse. So Nimrod, they've been chopped up live on television. Carol, you probably covered it. Like some sort of second-hand car, one of the most expensive pieces of military equipment in our history is chopped up. No, we're not bringing that. It's gone. Can't reverse that. There's a capability gap that we've now got to look at, and the document refers to that. And then there are others in the third category. So there's the ones we support, ones that we know we can't reverse, and others that, depending on the financial circumstances, and we need to look at. So things like on forces welfare, for example, some of these permanent changes to the benefit payments to Afghan war widows. It would be pretty ungenerous to think that that isn't something that if you were capable of doing so, you would reverse. But again, in the same way that almost no one, if you think about your own circumstance, almost no one here knows what their family finance is going to be like in 2015. And almost no one. You have to be in a pretty unusual set of circumstances to know exactly what your family finance will be in 2015. And it's even more so, of course, for government in terms of the shape of government finances. So we can't make any of those commitments.
You're not going to have loads of money though, are you? Can be sure of that.
It's unlikely, yeah. I think I've said this before, and we're all going to have to get used to a smaller state in the future. I've said it before. Now, on Afghanistan, my point is simply this, is it shouldn't be left to the opposition to make the government's case. Now, 2014 timelines and calendar, that's where we are. I think what the government has to do in the kind of transition towards 2014 and the change of purpose and role is be pretty clear. And earlier this month, the US Defense Secretary moved that 2014 timeline, appeared to move that 2014 timeline to a 2013 timeline. It's my understanding that caught the MOD by pretty significant surprise. And we had confusion. Now, the government now saying it's not a change of policy. At minimum, it's a change of emphasis, but more likely it's a change of policy. And I think what the government's got to do in Afghanistan is have genuine clarity. And bipartisanship in Afghanistan isn't something that can be demanded by government. It's got to be worked at. But quite often we support what the government is doing in Afghanistan despite the government, sometimes, not because of it. And the kind of churlish cheap thing to do would be to find reasons to break up bipartisanship. And my biggest worry is this, is that there just doesn't seem to be, and I genuinely hope I'm wrong, there does not seem to be a political process in Afghanistan at the moment that in any way comes close to matching the military effort. And the clock is ticking. And while people will make observations about our time in government and the lack of a political process, we didn't have that 2014 timeline, and we're 2 years later on, and there still doesn't seem to be a valid, strenuous, credible political process. Because ultimately this will be resolved by politics. It will be resolved by politics. So where is the political effort and the political strategy alongside the military effort?
Perhaps I could add something brief in both those points. On Afghanistan, the most important timetable is the one that the United States puts forward and is developing as we. The United States is, President Obama clearly wants to get his troops out and get the vast majority of his forces out, certainly of a combat role by early 2014, and that will have a big impact on the UK. And one of the real difficulties actually in the next year, not the next 3 years, next year, is that with most of the US Marines withdrawing from Helmand, from places like Sangin and Busakala and Gajaki, and with the United Kingdom government saying we will not backfill any of those US forces, then there are going to be some really very serious security problems in Helmand, well before any political process yields any results. So that's the immediate problem, which I think is going to consume a lot of time over the next year or so. And more broadly, there is no way in which the UK is going to continue in a major combat role in Afghanistan if the United States is not. And that's a reality of the nature of that operation. So I think we can have a debate about exactly whether it was wise or not for David Cameron to make exactly the commitment he made in relation to 2014, but I think it's being driven most of all by alliance politics. In relation to defence budgeting, the current MOD budget plan is based on the assumption that after the end of the spending review period, the equipment budget will rise by 1% per annum in real terms, and the rest of the budget will remain steady in real terms. And that's the basis on which they will announce that the budget is more or less balanced over the next 10 years. But if you look at the Chancellor's autumn statement, he is now budgeting on the assumption that departmental spending in real terms will fall in the 2 years after the spending review, in 2015 and 2016 and 2016-17. So if you put those two together, the government is assuming that just as we were withdrawing from Afghanistan, the Ministry of Defence will be given a higher budgetary priority than most other departments in government. And that may well be the intention of government to do so, but I think as we approach more firm decisions about government budgets in 2015 and 2016, I would be surprised, unless the economy recovers much more rapidly than is currently anticipated, I would be surprised if those MOD budget projections are viable under this government or indeed under any other.
I think we've got quite a lot of further questions. I think we will start taking it in braces as we make. Gentleman there, gentleman on the far wall as well. Name and organisation, please.
David Brown, I'm not affiliated, I'm a mere spectator on such important issues. Can I pick up one quite complex and important thing that all three of you discussed and ask a quick question? All of you have mentioned the turning point we're in and the change of nature of defence policy. We're now in the 21st century. Does that mean we're looking at the issues regarding declaring war, how we declare war, what war looks like? And it's not just about state-on-state action, it's about things like cyber-terrorism and bioterrorism and a group kicking off in various parts of the world and causing disruption elsewhere. We'll be having that fundamental discussion about how we declare war and what it looks like.
Gentleman there on the far wall as well. Name and organisation, please.
Gerard Shaw, EUK Consulting. My question is primarily directed to Jim Murphy. You talked about bioterrorism and biosecurity, and indeed your consultation paper talks about stockpiling of vaccines. But what I wanted to ask is, are the shadow defence team actually aware that the UK experienced a shortfall in the production of its anthrax vaccine in 2010 and 2011, and if you could comment on that, please.
I don't know whether Russell Brown, who handles, I think, cyber matters, wants to say anything on the cyber issue on later spokesman.
Yeah, I'll be very brief, because obviously you've indicated that there's a considerable number of people who do wish to raise further questions. I won't rehearse all the cyber issues that people in this room have got significant knowledge about, but suffice to say, one of the areas that we feel that we really do need to have more emphasis on is that cooperation between the private sector and government, because quite clearly, and if I can say to you, a couple of weeks back I attended a briefing one morning across in the House. There was a number of people sitting there saying, all of this is very abstract, and some people can't get their heads around it. And what I would say is the major infrastructure in our country, like any other country, operated and run by the private sector. But sometimes people at the top of those organisations haven't engaged fully in terms of what the cyber threats really are. So I think we want to put a little bit more emphasis on getting government and those private sector companies dealing with the infrastructure, get them more engaged as to how we can deal with some of the threats that we've recognised already and some that are coming down the road.
Jim, I don't know if you wanted anything to add because there was a mix of...
Well, the two questions are of course connected, and so apologies to Russell for Malcolm and I talking into a microphone to all your answers. You and Mrs. Duffy moment, Malcolm. I knew it was being heard, so I was more cautious. The first question from David, which the second one was connected to, was the nature of conflict, and you almost got to the kind of changing nature of the threats, electronic pulses, which the Defence Select Committee this morning has spoken of, and cyber, and all sorts of different areas. There's also part of your question seemed to be the democracy of war. What does that mean for the House of Commons in terms of democracy of war? What does it mean for ministerial accountability? What does it mean, for example, sounds trivial, but it's important, the US and the Canadians, for example, publish, is it quarterly, or written reports to the country about progress in Afghanistan. We have no such thing in the UK. We have quarterly updates and over an hour of questions in the House of Commons. And there's the issue about what is the democracy of decision-making around Libya that we're feeling around Syria. What does that teach us? So those are the sorts of things that we are looking at as well.
Could I just comment on the nature of war? It is an important question. In some respects, it's not new. I mean, I don't think actually any of my deployments we declared, as a nation, we declared war in all the places that I served over the years. But the way the conflict looks inevitably is different, and we do have to recognise that. And I do applaud the fact that I think the previous Labour government and the current government, the National Security Council, the National Security Strategy, recognising this is not just about defence. The military are the final instrument in a long process of all sorts of things that go on. I do think it comes back to how we see sovereignty in the world, and the idea of the old Westphalian states and so forth changing, the R2P that we've all discussed. What does that mean for us, and how do we then use the various instruments? And I think we've got to be careful. I mentioned those beforehand, but one of the ones, for example, on piracy. I think the more interesting space in piracy is the sort of higher order things. I mean, the strategic solutions, it seems to me, are tied more to insurers and finance companies than with boats and military. And there's something about the nature of industrial violence that we need to think about, and so on. So the whole of, what does conflict look like is much more complex. And I don't think it's just about using the military instrument. But you then, at the end of the day, do have to have that capable instrument. And my point about critical mass and an ability to deploy and do the things we want to do then comes into play.
I think just time for two more questions. If I take them as a gentleman here, gentleman there.
Is this on? This is for Jim Murphy.
Sorry,
John Ashmore, Politics Home. There's a figure which is bandied about quite a lot by the government. I think it was said by the Permanent Secretary at the end of the last government that there was a £38 billion black hole in the defence budget from Labour. Do you recognise that figure? And if so, how difficult is it going to be for you to rebuild your credibility on defence, which you've said is the foundation of the government's credibility?
James Eby, I'm a defence analyst. I think there's a question here of our strategic ambition, if you will. Will we be wanting to mount a unilateral defence or retaking of somewhere like the Falklands? If we do want to be able to act unilaterally, then we need to be able to equip ourselves to have that sort of range. But all of our activity over the last 15, 20 years has been coalition-based, and that's the way we seem to be heading as we operate. Clearly, the things that we purchase and the things that we plan on very much depend on what that ambition may be, and it'd be useful to get your feel for whether you see us being able to project power at range unilaterally, or whether really we are now consigned to operating almost exclusively within coalitions.
Two nice easy questions to finish with. John asked, do I recognise the 38 billion figure? Of course I recognise it, because the Conservative Party throw it at me every day. But so I'd be a fool not to recognise it. I don't believe it, but I recognise it. Look, it's not an MOD figure. It's not a National Audit Office figure. It's a Conservative Party headquarters figure that has entered the zeitgeist of the kind of commentariat, and probably for those of you who pay close attention to this, that's probably kind of one of the truisms that you believe to be the case. It's just the National Audit Office said that the funding pressure was between 6 and 36, and it was assuming no real terms growth over the decade. Now, Malcolm knows more about this than I do. He's looked at it pretty forensically. Of course there were pressures, but the 38 billion figure is a model lesson in modern political kind of attack. It should be studied as a pretty effective one. So for any of you here who were involved in it, congratulations. Really very effective. Now, how do I deal with that? Like, my sense of credibility, you cannot, I wanted to be the Shadow Defence Secretary. If we were in opposition, it's the job I wanted to be. I was a volunteer for this, I wasn't a conscript. And my sense is that you can't declare, you cannot self-declare your credibility. You've got to seek to demonstrate it and let others decide whether you have the credibility. Which is why we've done tough work in procurement, which is part of the response to the 6 to 36 billion funding pressure, and it's part of the reason why we're doing work today, and it's part of the work why we did enormous work on the military covenant, and they got the government to change their mind on it. But come the eve of the next election, the public will get a feel as to whether the Labour Party is serious in all these issues. I see it's my job, along with Ed Miliband, Douglas Alexander, and Ivan Lewis of Shadow Defid, Secretary of State, to demonstrate our sincerity and our credibility and our willingness to fund our values and our policies. But look, it's not for me to decide whether we're credible, it's for you folks and millions beyond this room. On James's point about coalitions, from the period that Labour was in power, I think you rightly allude to it, our assumption was we would operate within coalitions. Sierra Leone was a bit different for all sorts of reasons. This sometimes gets into a conversation, could you or should you do Sierra Leone in the future? We shouldn't lose the capability to do so. It's then whether whether you have the political will and contemporary consent from the public and from Parliament to do so. But our general posture is to operate within coalitions, occasionally be the lead nation in a coalition, and with other European allies, of course with the exemption of protecting our overseas territories, which are the core of any defence budget. There has to be a core capability that provides a sense that we can protect any of our overseas territories from any potential threat from any source permanently.
Without being clever about it, there's nothing new in this. Marlborough fought coalitions, Wellington led coalitions, Monty led coalitions. As a nation, we have been very clever and very good at leading coalitions, being engaged in coalitions and so on. The only difference with Monty is we get a big country house for winning the campaign like the other two did. So there's nothing new in it. It is part of who we are, and I think we are good at it, and we will continue to be good at it, in my view. Sierra Leone's, I don't think, are an issue. It's the Falkland Island type issue. Could we do it? I think we would struggle, but I think if the political will was there, the military could probably still deal with that issue. But it is an important issue. It's about what do you need to do on your own? What are you prepared to do on your own? Small, medium, large, how long for, what sustainability, how far away? And making difficult decisions to say, do you know what? We're not prepared to do that anymore on our own. We'll only do it in coalition. But there are some things, and I do think the Falklands is important, not just because of the economics of it, but because of the principle. And from a personal point of view, I think we did the right things 30 years ago, almost 2 months' time. And I think we should be able to do it, and we should be prepared to do it again if necessary. Hopefully it won't.
On the question of the 38 billion, I wrote something about this at the end of last year, trying to untangle some of these numbers. And basically, that number was constructed on the comparing what was in the programme for the next 10 years with the funding that would be available if there was no increase in the real terms budget. So these funding gaps are always comparing two numbers, two lines in the graph. And the SDSR had to find much larger savings than 38 billion over the 10 years because the spending review decided to make an 8% real cut in defence spending, and the total savings that had to be made as a result therefore come into somewhere around 70 or 75 billion. On the other hand, if you had looked at the trajectory of defence spending before the financial crisis in 2007 or 2008, then at that time you could have reasonably expected, on the basis of the previous decade, that defence spending would continue to grow in real terms by 1% or so. What really made the difference, what really created a black hole in defence budgeting, not entirely, but a very large part, most of it was the impact on the government finances of the financial crisis, and the fact that both the major parties going into 2010 election knew they had to make substantial reductions in total government spending. And defence was unlikely to be exempt from that process. And that was a fundamental driver for the fact that you had to make economies. Now, I think there was also one part of that 75, it was a result of the failure to have a defence review in 2005 for reasons we can all discuss, and that meant that some hard decisions which should have been taken there were postponed. But that was only part of the explanation. The financial crisis, I think, is a much bigger part of the issue. I mean, on the strategic ambition question which James raises, even Sierra Leone actually, we think in the UK of Sierra Leone as a unilateral British operation. And we sort of blank out of our thinking the big UN peacekeeping force there was there, the very large international aid effort there was that complemented. There were particular unilateral military operations by the UK, but it formed part of a broader international effort, a critical, essential part of a broader international effort to stabilise that country. And I agree that I think that the main scenarios in which unilateral action continues to be required in relation to dependent territories. And the Falklands will be very, very challenging indeed if we're talking about retaking them. There is no such thing as perfect security. But we try at present to minimise the risks of the Falklands by having a robust garrison there and an ability to reinforce it rapidly. But of course, military planners can think of some scenarios in which that might not be enough, but we have to keep being vigilant. What I think we couldn't do is have a situation in which our whole defence effort was distorted entirely around creating a zero-risk scenario in relation to the Falklands. We need to minimise that risk, we need to have effective deterrence against Argentina, but we can't let it overwhelm all our other security interests in a resource-constrained world.
Thank you, Malcolm. Stalin used to say in the matter of arms production that eventually enough quantity becomes quality, and judging by the numbers of you here today, we have managed to achieve both quantity and quality, and judging by the length of time you all stay, it's a tribute and testament, not so much to the quantity, but certainly to the quality of the discussions we've had here today. I think it's been the most valuable discussion. I know there was some question about not being committed to any individual defence platform. We hope you'll all here continue to be committed to the platform of policy exchange and defence platform. Thank you for coming.